And welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at game number 7 being played in the World Chess Championship match between Jan Nepomniachtchi from Russia and Ding Liren from China. Now, as we know, it's been a very back and forth match. Nepo has won, then Ding has recovered and won the next game. Very, very tight match. So game number 7, let's dive right into the action. Now, the game starts with Nepomniachtchi having the white pieces. Again, I apologize if my pronunciation is off, but that's how it goes. So the game starts with the move e4. We get e6 being played by Ding Liren. Now, this is a big surprise getting the French defense here. Certainly not what everyone was expecting. Ding has been playing e4, e5 every game of this match, and frankly, for more or less the last 10 years of his chess career. Occasionally, he has played the Caro-Kann as well, but he has not played the French to the best of my knowledge. So we get e4, e6. Now we get d4, d5, and here Jan plays the move knight d2. Now, those of you guys who were in chess at the very beginning of the pandemic, and even when the Canada's tournament started in 2020, you'll probably remember that Jan was actually playing the French defense himself with black. Now, Jan chooses to play the Tarrasch variation of the French. It was invented by Siegbert Tarrasch, the famous German master, a great theoretician. Now, it was surprising to see knight d2 because once again, when you're playing a world championship match, there's a lot that goes into the preparation, getting ready for it, and you spend months and months looking at the openings your opponents can play. Now, Jan, having played the French a lot with black, I would have expected him to play something a little bit more aggressive, something like knight to c3. And just as a sample variation to show you guys, we have this classic French winnow war with bishop b4, e5, c5, a3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and knight e7, queen g4. Now, this line is very aggressive. There's a lot of play for both sides. A lot can happen. But just to give you one illustrative example, c takes d4, queen takes g7, rook to g8, queen takes h7, queen c7 can be played here. If white takes the pawn on d4, you have queen c3 checking the king and winning the rook in the corner. Now, queen to d3 is the main move here because you guard the pawn on c3. Pawn takes pawn, knight to f3, b6, h4. Now, I'm not showing this because these are absolutely the best moves, but there is a specific reason. After bishop a6, queen d4, bishop takes f1, king takes f1, knight to d7, h5, rook to c8, h6, queen c4, takes, and bishop g5. This was played in a famous game in the first major online tournament called the Magnus Carlsen Invitational in 2020 between yours truly, Hikaru Nakamura, and Jan Nepomniachtchi with the black pieces. Now, having had such experiences, Jan on the black side of playing the French, I would have expected something more aggressive. Nonetheless, he plays knight to d2. We get pawn to c5 being played here. Now he plays this move knight g to f3. Now, once again, this move is also a little bit, it's one of the newer age, I guess, ideas here. It's not the main line. In the past, white normally has played pawn takes pawn on d5 in this position. And now after queen takes d5 here, you play the move knight g to f3. And now black normally will take on d4 and white plays bishop c4. Now, this was the main line for many, many, many years. And it's interesting to see the evolution of the variation and the piece placement, very specifically where the black queen goes. Now, this line has been played many times. And in the old days, queen to d6 was considered the main line. Essentially, the only two moves that were played were either queen to d8 or queen to d6. One main line way back in my heyday in the late 90s was this line with queen d6 castles. Knight to f6 to stop knight e4, knight b3, knight c6, we get knight b takes d4, knights come off, you get a6, rook to e1, queen c7, attacking the bishop on c4, bishop b3, and now let's move bishop d6. Now, in modern day theory, this is actually not considered great for black because there's a very aggressive knight sacrifice here with knight to f5. Black can't capture the knight due to the pin, and after bishop takes h2, king h1, black normally castles, and now you have this great resource, knight takes g7. Now, after knight takes g7, black plays king takes knight, and white has this amazing move, queen to d4. The point is you want to go bishop g5 to pin the knight on f6 and win it, or go queen h4 followed by bishop to h6 check. All kinds of right triangles here, and white is actually winning. Now, in the old days before computers, we didn't know this was completely winning, and there were actually some very quick draws that occurred after e5, queen h4, knight g4, bishop to h6, takes, check, and then white just makes a repetition here with queen g5 and queen f6. Now, in modern times, we now know that after this move f3, attacking the knight, queen to d8, bishop to g5, f6, and bishop c1, white is in fact winning here because the king is very open. The knight and the bishop are both under attack here. White can even go c3 and bishop c2 down the road, and as you can tell from the eval bar, it's very, very difficult to play. Now, this was the main line for many, many years, but in more recent times, probably I would say in the last like 5 to 6 years. Now people put the queen on d7, and the reason is that in the old days when you put the queen on d6, just to show one more point about this line, normally black was always putting the bishop on e7 and castling, or going queen c7 bishop d6, but additionally a lot of play focused around the light square bishop. Normally black is looking to put the bishop on d7 and potentially castle queenside or go bishop to c6. But in modern times, and with computer sort of the technology, the evolution of chess and the chess opening theory, nowadays this move queen to d7 is actually considered the main line. And after white castles, you still play knight c6, knight b3, but after knight f6 takes and a6 here, black actually has a different plan. Black can put the bishop on d6 or e7 or even c5 here, but black can also play b5 and immediately develop the light square bishop to b7 without wasting time. So what we've learned is that basically the idea of putting the bishop on d7 was fine, but in modern times, due to the help of computers, black now actually can develop the bishop to b7. So back to the game. Jan plays knight f3 to avoid all this. We get pawn takes pawn, we get knight takes pawn, knight f6, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight 2 to f3, trying to open up the scope for both of these bishops here. White wants to develop the bishop on c1 as well as the bishop on f1. So we get bishop to e7, bishop to c4 is played, and now we get this move knight to c6 being played here by Ding Liren. Now, according to the best of my knowledge, this move is a novelty. It's the first original move. Black has played castles here, even bishop to f6 to put pressure on the knight, but knight c6 is an original try. So we get knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, castles, queen to e2, very standard so far, nothing too crazy. And now we get this move bishop to b7. Now what you'll notice about this position here is that black has a compromised pawn structure. The pawns on a7 and c6 are split. However, black also potentially can create a big black center if he can get an f6 e5. So essentially all the play in this position hinges around one of two things. Can black get f6 and e5 and build this chain of 3? If he can, he's going to have an advantage. Or can black play c5 and bishop b7 to open up the long scope of the light square bishop? So in this position, bishop to b7 is played by Ding. We get bishop to d3 and now queen c7. It's worth noting here that c5 would be a big mistake, because after c5, white can play queen to e4, threatening the battery and the checkmate on h7. If black plays a move like knight to f6 to guard against the mate threat, white simply gobbles the bishop on b7. Additionally, if you play g6 to stop the mate, white can now go c4 attacking the knight, and when you move the knight, let's just say b6, after queen takes b7, queen takes d3, queen takes e7, white has an extra bishop on the board. And if black goes knight to b4, after queen takes b7, knight takes d3, white can play bishop h6, attacking the rook. Rook moves away, and then after rook f to d1 here, white is simply winning due to this pin of the knight. You can't really move the knight anywhere because you lose your queen. If you play a move like rook b8, which is a very logical continuation, white goes queen to e4, and you will lose either the knight or the queen in this position, and you're going to be down at least a piece and losing the game. So after bishop to d3, we get queen to c7 being played here by Ding Liren, queen to e4 played by Nepo, threatening the checkmate, and now knight to f6 because the bishop on b7 is no longer hanging. Now it's worth noting the computer actually thinks that black can play g6 here, and black is maybe already better because of the fact that there really are no weaknesses on the dark squares. Say white plays bishop h6 and you go rook f d8, let's just say rook a d1. You can even play a move like bishop f6 c3 and bishop g7 potentially, and black is not getting checkmated. The king is going to be very safe with these pawns. You can always move the queen over, move the knight back, and again, not saying this is the best way for black to play, but there really are no major threats here for white. So g6 would have been a better move, but instead we get knight to f6. After knight to f6, queen to h4 is played by Jan, and now we get c5, opening up the scope of the light square bishop. Now at this point, looking at this position, I know the commentators on Ishigiri, Daniel Naroditsky, they felt very concerned about the position, but having looked at this, I felt that Ding was already doing completely fine, and to me it felt as though out of the opening had been a success for Ding Liren. He was close to equal, and Jan had not gotten a lot of pull. The play is not super obvious here, and so I actually really like Ding's position. So we get bishop to f4, attacking the queen, queen to b6, and now we get knight to e5. Now of course what Nepo is aiming for here is he's hoping that Ding will play queen takes b2, because now you have rook a b1, and when the queen moves you lose the bishop. And let's just say black plays a random move like rook a c8 here, you actually lose now to knight d7, which removes the defender of the checkmate on h7. The knight can no longer guard the pawn. If you take the knight, checkmate in 1. If you move the queen, we swap the juicers, checkmate in 1. So you would have to give up your queen here with something like h6, and again, this is completely lost. So After knight e5, we get rook a d8, stopping this knight d7 threat, and now the move rook a e1 is played here by Nepo. Now, one of the very difficult things at the higher levels of chess is you have to figure out where do the rooks belong. Now, in a position like this, the first thought, at least to me, is that the rooks objectively belong on d1 and e1, because if you think about this position with the rooks on d1 and e1, the rook on d1 is on an open file, the rook on e1 can lift and go to h3 or g3, also maybe some sacrifices. The rooks just look fundamentally correct on these two squares. But the problem here is that if you play rook fe1, for example, you also have to worry about moves like rook to d4, and long term, just to illustrate the point, you have to worry about some threats like knight to e4 with threats towards the pawn at f2. Now, in this exact position, it doesn't work out because the rook's in the way, but nonetheless, intuitively, it feels like there are going to be some issues with the pawn. So Nepo decides to play rook a e1 and put both rooks on e1 and f1, hoping to maybe use this rook on the f file later on, as we will see. So now g6 is played here by Ding, and we get bishop to g5, rook to d4, only move, by the way. If you move the knight here, you simply lose a piece. And so after rook d4, you're attacking the queen on h4, and if white chooses to play this move f4 here, this actually loses because now black has this nasty move c4, opening up the scope on this long diagonal. If you play a move like bishop takes c4, there's rook takes f4, and spaghetti-o, it's the classic fossil. You will lose the queen, and you will lose the game, and probably lose the world championship. So we get queen to h3 played by Nepo, queen to c7 retreating, and now b3 is played here. Idea to stop c4, but also potentially put a knight or a bishop on the c4 square. So now we get knight to h5, a move that I absolutely love here, because what Ding realizes in this position is that he can't really create more in the center. He can't really push the c pawn. So what he needs to do here is he wants to trade the pieces, because long term here, if you look at white's pieces, the queen on h3 is sort of on the edge of the board. No real threats towards the pawn on h7. The rooks on e1 and f1 are okay, but they're not doing a whole lot either. So after knight to h5, we get pawn to f4 here. Of course, white does not want to trade the bishops, because after queen takes on e7 here, white is maybe okay, but let's just say you play a move like rook e3. Now there's a move like knight to f4 here. The knight and the bishop are very strong on this diagonal. It's of course a fork of the queen and the pawn as well, and white is losing the game. So Nepo plays f4, very aggressive move here. And now at first glance, you probably wonder, well, but black can just trade. And in this position, you have the double G pawns, can't really be that great. And even knight to f4 looks good. But the problem is that if you trade on g5 and play knight to f4 here, white can actually go queen to h6. And now it starts getting very scary. If you play a move like knight takes g2, white can go bishop takes g6 here, threatening mate in 1 on h7. If you take with the f pawn, it's mate in 1 anyway. And if you take with the h pawn, after knight takes g6, I'm threatening queen h8 mate. Of course, f8 is still a threat, and probably there's some way for black to stop the mate, but you're going to lose the game, as you can see from the bar, because it's plus 33.8. So in this position, Ding plays bishop d6 instead, and what Ding is trying to argue is now this bishop on g5 is not very active. Knight in the center, not super active here. No big sacks on g6 or f7, so black should be better in the long term. However, having said that, you do have one bad piece, which is this rook on d4, which is not all that well placed. So when c3 is played here by Nepo, Ding has to sack the rook with knight takes f4. Now it's worth noting the computer gives us double exclam move. Now this is a good move, perhaps the only move in the position, so I'm a little bit skeptical of the double exclamation mark, because I do think that actually rook takes f4 is probably losing, so rook takes and rook h4, so it's a little bit questionable that it gives it a double exclam, considering that it's probably the only move. So after knight takes f4, we get bishop takes f4. Now it's a very interesting moment in the game here, because Nepo could have played rook takes f4, and after bishop takes e5, you don't take the rook because black takes the rook on f4, and you're simply down a pawn. But you do have a nasty little trick with this move bishop takes g6 here, because now you're threatening mate in 1, so if bishop takes f4, it's mate again. And if black takes with the f pawn, you have queen takes e6 check, king g7, trade the rooks, and you go bishop h6 check. King has no squares. If you block with the bishop, it's mate in 1. And if you go queen g7, I simply take. Again, if you take with the bishop, mate in 1. Take with the king, I take the bishop, take the rook. Queen and a rook versus bishop. Pretty sure anybody could beat me from this position. So there was this idea with bishop takes g6, and black probably should take with the h pawn, and after pawn takes, the point of sacking on g6 is that now if black takes the rook, you go bishop f6, and there's a classic lobster pincer checkmate on h8 very soon with queen to h8. Black really can only stop it by simply taking on g2, although I guess even this doesn't stop the lobster pincer, because there's still rook h1 and rook h8 anyway. So after knight takes f4, Nepo had this idea, but instead he takes with the bishop. Now I don't really like this, because now after rook takes, rook, and bishop takes e5, black has sacrificed the rook, but black has a bishop and a pawn for the rook. Additionally, the bishops are very active here on all the diagonals, and I do think that black should be a little bit better. So we get rook to h4 played here by Nepo to attack the pawn on h7, and now this move rook to d8 is played by Ding. Now rook to d8 is probably the best move. I would say here, having said that, I do feel like there are probably alternatives as well, moves like h5. Nonetheless, we get rook d8. Now bishop to e4 is played by Nepo, and here Ding makes a very committal decision. Now Anish Giri in the live broadcast was talking about this, and I fundamentally do agree with Anish. This decision to trade the bishops is extremely committal, because even though objectively it's the best move in this position, the big advantage black has for being down the exchange with the bishop and the pawn for the rook is that black has the bishop combo. So when you have the bishop pair here, I think it's very committal trading off. I personally would have played bishop to a6, and after rook to h7 played bishop g7. Now again, it might look a little bit scary here with the rook and the queen, but your king side is extremely solid with these three pawns here in the triangle. So because of that, I think that Ding should have done this. I will say, if Ding had done this, I think there's a very good chance that Ding would have won this game, because just looking at it, black's play is very easy. You can go rook d2, you can go queen f4, there are kebabs, all kinds of other threats like ice skaters on the back rank, and to me it just looks very easy for black to play, and I think Ding would have probably won the game if he had done this. Instead, Ding decides to trade the bishops. Now again, this position is still okay, but now because you only have a bishop on the board versus the rook, if black can trade rooks or queens here, or not black, sorry, if white can trade either rooks or queens, white is going to have very serious winning chances. So after rook takes e4, we get rook to d5 played by Ding to guard the bishop, keeping the ideas of the kebab alive, and of course keeping control over the d file. Here we get rook h4 played by Nepo. Now you probably wonder, why can't white go c4 and win the bishop? Rook moves, you take the bishop. However, if you play c4 attacking the rook here, black can play bishop d4 check first, and after king to h1 simply move the rook to say f5, and black is much better here with the classic wooden shield in the middle of the board. So here instead we get rook to h4 played by Nepo, we got queen to d6 played by Ding, and now let's move queen to e3. Now we start to see why Nepo played this weird looking rook h4 move. It was not to actually gobble the pawn on the edge, but it was so that he could move the queen and guard the pawn on h2 with the rook. Now it's also worth noting here that this is why I think Ding should have kept the bishops on the board, because when he plays queen d6 here, he realizes that this pawn on h7 is actually not all that important. It's something of a poison pawn. So after queen to e3, we get h5 played by Ding, simply creating the classic flying V formation for anybody who watched the Mighty Ducks movies. We get g3 played here by Nepo to stop the threats towards the pawn in h2, and now we get bishop f6 and this move rook to c4. Now at this point, black should be a little bit better here with the bishop and the pawn for the rook, mainly because you control the only completely open file here, which is the d file. Additionally, white's king is a little bit loose, and more importantly, the pawns here for white are also not well placed. The bishop is also always spying this pawn on c3. If you play a move like, let's just say b4 for example, after takes, there's always bishop d4, and you're just simply down a pawn here. And if you ever end up playing c4, even if I just set up a random position, for example, like this, if black can get the bishop to d4 here, or even go queen a5, you're not really able to use this pawn majority of 3 and create a pass pawn on the queen side. So because of that, in this position, it's very, very tricky to play here, because you can't push the pawns. If you can't push the pawns, and black's king side is so stable here with this pawn structure and the great bishop on f6 spying everything, black should have an advantage. Here, however, Ding plays this move h4 after a 4-minute think. Now keep in mind, of course, this is move number 31. The players are getting low on time, they're starting to feel some nerves, and you don't get any increment. So h4 itself is not a bad move, but it's a very committal move, because now when Jan captures his pawn at h4, black has to basically prove the advantage. As they say in this famous classic movie from the 90s, Jerry Maguire, this is the show me the money moment here. It's basically show me the money. You've sacked a pawn on the edge of the board, you have to do something. And Ding does not do something. He plays rook to d2, and this move is a big mistake by Ding, primarily because in this position, if he goes bishop e5 back, threatening the pawn in h2, white has a lot of trouble guarding this pawn. If you play a move like rook to e2, black can actually take the pawn anyway, and after rook h2, rook to d1 check, king moves to g2, black has rook d2, and if you give up the queen, you do have 2 rooks for the queen here, but with all these central pawns that can push down the board very fast for black, the queen is much stronger than the 2 towers. So it doesn't really guard the pawn if you play rook e2. If you play a move like queen to e2 here, there might even be a move like bishop f4 followed by rook to d2, and computer says after rook e4, rook d2, and queen f3, white is okay. But in a world championship match, a lot of pressure, nerves on the line. Are you really going to play a move like rook e4 just allowing the kebab on the 7th rank? I'm not so sure. So at this point, it's very, very dangerous, very, very hard to play. And if you go queen f2, e5, now you have the classic wooden shield, and the bishop is guarded on f4. And in practical play here with limited time, it feels to me like this should be much easier to play for black. Instead, Ding plays this move rook to d2, which is a mistake because now Jan plays rook to e2, and here we get the mistake of the game with this move rook d3. Now at this point, black can still probably save the game with a move like rook to d1, king g2, and rook to d5, and I do think due to the solid pawn structure, being able to swing the rook to h5, there still would be pretty good drawing chances. That being said, white is a little bit better here. Instead, Ding plays this move rook to d3, and now Nepo plays queen takes c5. Now, I don't know what Ding missed here. Again, you can't be too critical of the players because they're obviously under a lot of pressure. It's a very long game. The stakes are super high here. I don't know if Ding thought he had some bishop d4 trick, or if he simply thought there was a check on d5, or frankly, if he just missed that queen takes c5 was even a move. Like, there is some chance that he missed that white could simply take the pawn. However, after queen takes c5 is played, Ding is now in a lot of trouble, and Ding in fact is probably losing here, and the reason is quite simple. If you can't dodge the queen trade, we're going to have the situation where now white is going to have 2 rooks against a rook and a bishop. To add insult to injury, don't forget that you already started pushing p on the king side, so you gave up your extra pawn by going h5 h4 already. Now you're losing a pawn on the queen side, and it's going to be 2 rooks versus a rook and a bishop. Complete catastrophe here. Everything is falling apart. If you play a move like queen d7 here, white can simply go queen c8 check, forcing the queens off the board, and again, now you have 3-on-1 on the queen side, and you're going to be able to push p and win the game quite simplistically. So here, Ding goes rook d1, we get king to g2 played by Nepo, and now this move queen to d3 is played here. Now, Ding is hoping for a miracle here. He's trying to use the queen and the rook, attack the king, but unfortunately, the king is actually as snug as a bug in a rug here, and Nepo correctly plays this move rook to f2. Now you'll notice that all the squares are covered. The rook on f2 stops any of these checks on f3, e2, or f1 here. There are no checks. Rook on c4 covers the e4 check, and the queen on c5 covers the d5 square here. And to make matters worse, now your rook on your bishop on f6 is under attack. So Ding plays king to g7 here, and now Nepo correctly plays rook c to f4. He swings his rook over, he creates the classic Wendy's double sack, attacks the bishop on f6, and now black is simply lost. Ding, of course, very low on time, as you can tell, ends up resigning the game here, or maybe he played queen takes c3 but flagged. At any rate, the game ends here with queen takes c3, and Nepo wins this huge epic game number 7. So what does this mean, you guys? This means that now Nepo retakes the lead in the match by a score of 4-3. We now have had 5, I believe, if I'm not saying 5 to do the Booker T reference, 5 decisive games in a row here. Nepo wins another game with the white pieces. This is now 2 games in a row he's won, and it just keeps getting wilder and wilder here. Actually, it's not 5 in a row, but nonetheless, there have now been 5 decisive games in the match. This means that Nepo leads 4-3, and what to say? Now, I will say this. From the general standpoint, looking from afar, there are a couple things that need to be noted. First of all, it's very clear this match is different from previous matches, primarily because, in my opinion, and maybe I'm wrong on this, I do not believe that Ding Laurent prepared the French very heavily before the match. I think this is something that probably at the start of the match, or maybe after a couple of games, he spoke to Richard Rapport, his second, and he asked him to create some files. And so I don't think this was something that Ding spent months looking at, so I think it's more like playing on the fly. That being said, the opening was an epic success for Ding Laurent. He survived the opening. He was clearly better at some point in this game. So he had the advantage. Everything was going in his favor. He was doing very well, but then he makes a huge blunder, loses. And so psychologically, it's a crushing blow to play a big surprise and survive, and then make a blunder and lose, and basically use the surprise, ruin the surprise, and everything goes the wrong way. Very difficult. So psychologically, very, very difficult for Ding Laurent to recover from this. For Nepo, huge win. He kept his nerves about himself today at the critical moments in a way that Ding did not, or was unable to. So Nepo takes the lead by 4-3. Now, we are going to have another rest day tomorrow before game number 8. But this game has been so swingy, so wild, so back and forth. You really don't know what's going to happen. And so we just wait and see. Now, like I said, a few days ago, I thought Nepo was going to win the match. Maybe I'll be proven right. But I will not say the same thing because based on the last 2 games, it's very topsy-turvy and anything can happen. So I do hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of game number 7 of the World Chess Championship match being played between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Ding Liren from China. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and we'll be back soon with some more great recaps of the World Chess Championship. See you guys. Bye.